depending on the time.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Are we good now?
Yep.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Mackinaw Historical Society Lecture Series. We're very excited to have you here. The second Monday of every month, right here. We try to have an interesting program. Kyle, make sure it's interesting, right? Okay. Interesting program about history and natural sciences of the area. We're glad for all the people that are here. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment of silence for Jerry Pryor, who was one of our founding members. And he passed away April 10th, and he was a very well-known artist in the area, a community member, and truly a man. Him and his wife both truly helped the Historical Society get started. So if we take a minute for Jerry. Thank you.
Didn't you say that he was blind too, or I got him mixed up with someone else?
No, Jerry had his eyes, but they probably at the end may have been going, but I don't recall him ever being blind. My name's Angie Morthland, president of the Historical Society, and without further ado, I'm going to give the young man who we all came to hear. Kyle Bagnell is a naturalist, a park naturalist for Millcreek Park, and I'm excited. You're going to kind of give us a little bit more background about that.
Sure, I'll give you some background.
You promise?
I promise.
Okay, so without further ado, give Kyle Bagnell a round of applause.
You're welcome. Just gonna pull that way. All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to share some stories with you today about historic Millcreek. First, I'll kind of share a little bit about myself. So I've always been a Michigander. In fact, one of my lines goes 8 generations back, so I've been back for quite a while. And always in southeast Michigan. Grew up in Richmond, Michigan. And came up here as a Boy Scout on the Scout Service Camp in Mackinaw Island. So I did that for 6 seasons and became a park interpreter at Fort Mackinaw from 1990 through 94. So after that time, my focus has been on environmental history because I got my degree in public history from Western Michigan University in 1993 and worked at a couple nature centers in Midland, Michigan, and came up here to take Jeff Dykehouse's position after he retired. COVID was a little bump in the road, but I finally got here in February of 21. So my title is Park Naturalist, and my main site is out at Historic Millcreek, where I'm the site supervisor. And then I also do programs on Mackinaw Island. We have naturalists and historical interpreters at Millcreek, and then also a naturalist at the new Milliken Nature Center at Arch Rock this year, and also an intern over there helping out with a forest survey and some invasive species work. So that's my story, that's my plan, and Leanne's got that hidden there. So I wanted to start, and what we're going to do is we'll talk a little bit about, I'm sure you've all been to Millcreek and know of Millcreek. We're going to go beyond the sawmill, if you will, and then look at some of the other side stories, more modern stories. The mill closed in 1839, so there's lots more going on out there over many, many years. And just to be perfectly clear about what we're talking about, I wanted to start with this. Are we plugged in, Leanne?
We're still trying.
Technology will work.
I wanted to start with this map, just so we're crystal clear on what we're talking about. And that is Millcreek. So, the map we're looking at is from 1810. It's a survey, and here's a transcription of it that shows the entire old military reservation that surrounded Fort Michilimackinac, which is right here. And you'll see when I zoom in on it. But Millcreek is here on this edge, private claim 334. And then private claim 335 is the old McGulpin farm over here, just to the west of us. So let's zoom in on this a little bit, and I've colored in the lake. So now you can see, this is Aaron Greeley's 1810 survey map. And here's the boundary of the reservation, 11,000 acres plus. There's Michilimackinac. You can see Millcreek. He actually drew it in there. And there's private claim 334. So that's Millcreek, 640 acres, and 335 was also 640 acres. My 6th great-grandfather, Joseph Kilbourne, had private claim 31 on the Rouge River in Detroit. So Aaron Greeley actually surveyed that 640-acre ribbon farm, that long, skinny farm in Detroit, the year before he came up and surveyed the private claims of Mackinaw. So we'll just kind of go through a few maps just to kind of see how things were depicted over the years. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but this is just a lake survey from 1822. And you can see over here on the left-hand side, you can see it says sawmill. It's got a couple buildings there. The buildings always change sides, change numbers, and all that, and they did change over time at Millcreek historically. So there's some truth to that, but otherwise there also could be some mystery to it because we don't know if they actually saw the site very much when they were there doing this whole survey of the entire lake. What I like about this one in particular is that it shows this bluff, this rocky bluff, and stone or rock is definitely a big part of our story that we'll talk a little bit about later today. This map by A.G. Ellis is actually upside down. So we're going to flip it over and you show Dousman's Mill in 1834. Michael Dousman, you'll see, bought the property from the Campbells. And then here's the McGulpin Farm over here on the left-hand side as well. And you can see French Farm Lake going out into the bay there. All right, so the site was originally constructed about 1785 or 1790. We're not sure of the exact year by Robert Campbell. He lived here at Mackinaw, moved over to Mackinaw Island when the settlement moved there. He lived till 1808, and then his son John ran the property for another 11 years. And John was also particularly a blacksmith. Robert was a merchant involved with a number of different things. He was actually a judge for the county, although we don't think he tried any cases. It was kind of near the end of his life. But the land claims that John made once they started doing that official process with the U.S. government really depict or had in writing some of the things that were here. So we know that there was a sawmill and a grist mill. And the more I research about it, even though it's very scant evidence, they were probably in the same structure. I've saw other ones of a similar time period that were in the same building. They said valuable buildings is one of the notes on there. So there was houses, a workshop, which we have reconstructed. 40 acres of valuable hay fields. That was a big part of the history of the site, was the agricultural products. You only really run the mill in the spring. We'll talk a lot more about water here in a minute, just because of the volume of water. So it was good to have this hay. Before hay fields were available, they had to cut wild hay at the marshes, like at the mouth of the Pine River up north of St. Ignace. A great number of cattle, you can see, and a large orchard. And these are just some of the different maps. Even in the 1820s, I like this when they were measuring the distance, the different plots on Mackinaw Island, and they still called that Campbell's, even though he had sold it 4 years prior to that. So here's Michael Dousman. So he buys the property in 1819. He bought everything he could because he was just a big landowner and bought lots of different things around the area. He had the largest farm on Mackinaw Island. He never lived at the site. He lived on Mackinaw Island, so his employees would have lived over here. He would be the one who's constructed the current millwright's house that we've reconstructed at the site. And he actually died in 1854, and his heirs sold the property in 1856. We'll look more closely at this map, but it's a fantastic map from 1835 that showed Dousman the sawmill right here, and also a little clearing right there with some of the hay fields, as that was a military road going from Saginaw to Mackinaw. So I mentioned the sawmill, of course, but it was also a grist mill. From other historical documents a little bit later, especially newspaper accounts, we know that a Mr. Myers came about 1860 and took the old mills that were stones that were just lying in the creek and took them over to Sheboygan, where he put them in his mill. They moved around a little bit, and there's a whole other story about the grist mill that we won't get into. But it was mentioned that they were made from granite boulders found along the shore. So that's why I put a granite boulder on it. If you look closely at it, definitely granite. It also mentioned that they were bound in iron, and you can see the rust all the way around the edge of the outside. You can see rust marks on the inside of the eye where the different pieces were that held the runner stones at the top, so it would spin around, and the bottom bedstone would just stay in one spot. The bedstone we got first, it was broken, and then the runner stone came a little bit later on. But it's also a nice quarter dress pattern. They probably would have mostly ground corn, which is what was really the grain that was growing up here at the time. So now we're going to look at the natural resources of the site. We're going to look at the water. We're going to look at the trees and the plants. We're going to look at something else. We're going to look at the furs and fish and things like that, and then we're also going to look at the stone. So first of all, water. And it's good always to kind of step back and take a bigger look at whatever we're looking at. If we're looking at Mill Creek, it's a very small, contained, little tiny site, but if we look at the Great Lakes, it's connected to the largest freshwater system in the entire world, right? So we've got 94,000 miles of surface area of water, and Mill Creek is part of that. 84% of all of the freshwater in North America and 21% of the whole world supply of surface freshwater. And we can start zooming in and we can look at this beautiful Lake Huron that we're on the shores of. And this wonderful map shows it is the 4th largest freshwater lake in the world. And look at how much is up here as well, kind of east of the Bruce Peninsula and Manitoulin Island. The 2nd largest Great Lake, and it's got 30,000 islands, which is absolutely amazing. And of course, 23,000 surface miles of, or square miles of surface area, and almost 2,000 miles of shoreline. If you add all those miles of the islands, it's much larger than that. This is the shore at Mill Creek, so we do have part of the site that's right on the shore. It's hard to get to, but you can park along the roadway and head over there. It's not a terribly deep lake. Lake Superior, of course, is much deeper. It's 751 feet, and it's 206 miles long. So if water flows from Mill Creek, and it flows into Lake Huron, which it does constantly every day of the year since way before we were born, it would take about 22 years for that to completely flush that water all the way through Lake Huron as it's headed south towards Lake Erie and beyond, and eventually to the Atlantic Ocean. So I like to think when I lived downstate, when I lived in Midland, for example, for many years, our water came from Lake Huron, and I probably drank water that flowed out of Mill Creek when I lived down in Midland all those years. So now we can take a look from that watershed level and zoom it down to a smaller watershed. So this beautiful map from 1930 shows all the major watersheds of Michigan. So the major river or the major system that everything flows into. So the biggest one in our area is the Sheboygan River. Of course, it's a large river, and it's got Mullet Lake and Burt Lake and Black Lake all kind of flow into the Sheboygan River. But we're right up there at Mill Creek. And it basically says small streams running into the lake. So there's not one major watershed. There's all these smaller watersheds. They're kind of independent of each other flowing into the lake. So Mill Creek, it really, as its own watershed, is quite small. And you take a look at a map like this, or a photograph. This is from 1953, which is getting a while back now, as we're getting further into the 21st century. In 1954, and this is early in the year, but you can also see that still a lot of this is growing up, even though a lot of leaves aren't on the trees yet. But you can see the creek flowing through the landscape here. And really, Mill Creek is only about 4 miles long altogether. So here's a view from Google Earth from 1998, and you can kind of actually measure it out all the way, and you get up exactly 4 miles in this particular case. And of course, here's the line now. If we take the private claim and we draw it on the map. So again, a little bit different time of year, but still a lot of logging and cutting of trees happened for many, well, centuries really, not just decades, and a lot of that is growing back up again in more recent times. And here's a more colorful version of it. And we're going to take a quick look at where Mill Creek starts up there near Dingman Marsh. So here's a view of Dingman Marsh. Has everyone been to Dingman Marsh before? Kind of out in the 2 tracks there. But Dingman Marsh was created in 1958 with this dam was put in to flood up to 1,200 acres for a state waterfowl breeding area. So they were, especially the waterfowl they wanted to resurrect were things like Canada geese. They were getting quite rare at the time. I know. Mallard ducks, wood ducks, all these common ducks and waterfowl that we think of today were critically endangered in the early 20th century. And they promised that when they did this, it would not harm the commercial blueberry harvest, which I thought was interesting, still happening in the middle of the 20th century. And it's a beautiful spot. When I went there last summer, it was quite dried up. The water levels do vary over time. But we have had loons and trumpeter swans, both nesting out there. And I've seen both of them. I took these pictures, but not at that location. But they're both great northern species, key species that are thankfully here in our northern country. So if you're looking at the big, beautiful lake of 1,200 acres, and you turn the other way, this is Mill Creek, headed down towards the lake. Very shrubby, very small, and there's no kayaking on this part of it for sure. But is from this little meager trickle is what eventually flows down to Millcreek, powers our mill, and flows through the site for, again, about 4 miles. One thing I did find when I was taking these pictures was a wonderful praying mantis at one time. So it's not specifically mantid habitat, but it just was a great little discovery. So you never know what you might find. And looking at me right there. So here it is, just flowing along. It really never completely freezes. There's always some free-flowing water, but it does reduce to a trickle, especially in the heat of summer, and it really isn't powerful enough then to power the mill. So again, it was mostly a spring activity, and we'll take a little bit more look at that as we get on here. So the reason that the sawmill is built is to interact with the trees and the plant life that is out at Millcreek. And if you start looking at all the different documents and maps and accounts and surveys, you can kind of really put together a picture of our plant life that's out in that area, which of course we share here in Mackinaw City as well. So this is a picture I put of all these different plants that I found in historical documents, maps, accounts, surveys, whatnot, that are specifically listed historically being at Millcreek. So everything from white pine and beech and hemlock and willow and spruce and cranberries and on and on and on. We'll take a look at some of those. So one of the earliest accounts we have of a specific tree or a specific activity happening with trees at Millcreek is in 1771. Corporal John Annan was standing in the wrong spot, we believe, and the tree fell on him. So very likely this crew, this corporal of the 2nd Battalion, 60th Regiment, was out at Millcreek, probably in a winter wood chopping detail, because he died in February of 1771. When they were constructing the railroad here in 1881, it opened in 82, from Sheboygan to Mackinaw City, here it describes that workers came across, this is a reproduction, a thin copper sheet with writing on it, and they transcribed it. And it was owned at this time by a Mr. Murphy, who had it framed, and he was a proud owner of this historical artifact. And basically, they said that they were constructing the railroad, a mattock, which was hacking away the ground, basically uncovered this thin piece of copper, 9.5 inches square, and it said, "Here lieth the body of John Annan, late corporal in the 2nd Battalion, 60th Regiment, who departed this life February 10th, 1771, aged 51 years. So they figured it was probably on a board that marked his grave. Why they didn't haul him back to Mackinaw and put him in the cemetery over there, I'm not sure. They thought that was a good spot for him. And we don't know where that artifact ended up. So I've tried to look who Mr. Murphy was and where his family might be, but it is gone. But it's a great description of this interesting relic. So probably cutting wood. I mean, you think if Fort Mackinaw, Mackinaw was constructed in 1715, it had that many decades, all the way to 6 decades to 1771, chopping wood for construction and for firewood, and they constantly needed more and more wood, and they would just keep going out and out until they could haul it back to the fort, especially in the wintertime on the ice. The first written account we have of the sawmill itself is from Captain William Doyle, American commander at Fort Mackinaw in British commander at Fort Mackinaw in 1793. The Americans arrived in 1796. And he had made a contract for a sufficient number of boards, which he must send to Campbell's sawmill for whenever the large boats are repaired. The British had resisted doing repairs on the fort because they knew they would eventually have to finally leave because the war had ended in 1784, and they just kind of hung around because they were still happy to control the fur trade in the northern Great Lakes. Later that year, he was repairing the barracks in 1793, but just 3 years later, the British would have to leave. And this is a sketch from a book from 1808, The Art of the Carpenter, which was published in Paris. When the Americans arrived in 1796, Major Burbeck has to analyze what's going on at Fort Mackinaw, finds it in horrible disrepair, and needs to send to Campbell's for boards as well. He comes over to visit old Mackinaw on the Main, old Mackinaw. And what he finds there is the remains of the old picketing are almost buried in the drifted sand. No kind of wood within 2 or 3 miles but poor scrubby pine. So we're a little further away than that. We're about 4 or 5 miles from Mackinaw, Mackinaw, but nevertheless, you can get an idea of the kind of plant life that was right around the ford here. Here's a graphic of it, a little bit later on, but it kind of gives you an idea of this kind of desolate landscape with some things growing back up. And then, of course, Millcreek itself, again, this artist rendition when we were first opening the park in 1984, gives a view of the landscape around and all the trees and the logs that were piled up and whatnot. And the sawmill would have been the going concern. It ran for about 50 years altogether. Built by Campbell, eventually run by Dousman, and it shut down in about 1839. Amazingly, when they did archaeological excavations in the late 1970s to figure out what was where, they found the dam. Not the mill itself, but they found the dam. And these boards, first of all, are white pine boards. They were on the leading edge of the dam as a ramp, so it wouldn't push the dam over. And then they had these cobbles in between. It's a cribbed dam with walls on either side, filled with stones in the middle, and a ramp on the upstream side to relieve the water pressure. And they even found these sill beams underneath the water. They diverted the stream at this point, and still preserved. In its anaerobic condition, this oxygen-free environment, these boards were still preserved. And of course, if you go to Millcreek, that's one of my favorite artifacts, is these old boards here, big, wide, white pine boards of all things, underneath the water for so many years. So now we go back to Aaron Greeley with that map that just had kind of disintegrated. I'm sure it was a fine map when he first drew it, but he also wrote notes about his survey. And one thing that he mentioned was that this corner post that he put in was 63 chains, 20 links with a surveyor chain to a maple tree. So this whole upper part of the property is maple. And today we have our Sugar Shack loop there, beech maple forest. A little bit of it fell down in the ice storm, but it's not too bad. And again, near the lake, we have more of the pine and the cedar and the spruce and whatnot, a little bit closer to the cool lake shore. In 1820, when the Cass expedition was heading through the Straits of Mackinac, James Doty was traveling along with them, and he mentions on June 6, 1820, off the upper end of Bois Blanc, about 10 miles distant on the Main, is a sawmill. That's our mill. The timber around it is pine. So they were also pine. Again, probably closer to the shore. Now we also know that Millcreek was used for certain buildings at Mackinaw. So we mentioned the fort a little bit, but also a mission house, which is the Protestant mission there, which is used for state park housing today. That was constructed in 1825. A better account is when Mission Church was constructed in 1830. It was constructed by this man, Martin Haydenberg. He had come over to the mission principally as a carpenter. He ended up being a teacher as well, but it was said he was a better carpenter than a teacher. And they sent him over a few years after they constructed the school because they decided that they wanted a church for not only the mission itself, but for the whole community. So he comes over in the winter of 1829, 1830, and later he writes about his experience. So this is probably March of 1829. Or 1830, rather. In 3 weeks' time, we had all the timber hewed, 50 pieces flattened to be made into scantling and joist with a whip saw. So they're using still the manual pit saw or whip saw. And 300 saw logs hauled out of the woods to the shore, ready to be moved home or to the sawmill when the ice should prove favorable. So they ended up being able to move it to the sawmill. They moved it to Dousman's mill. They cut it up into boards. And he mentioned that Michael Dousman had a sawmill about 2 miles from our logs, and we soon had them there. After they were sawn into boards, it was still April of 1830. They sent all the French trains on Mackinaw Island. So this was a long, skinny box sleigh pulled by a horse over on the ice, which was about 2 feet thick, from Mackinaw Island to Millcreek, about the 1st of April, 1830. Think of what it's like right now. Loaded them all up with wood that was sawn from 300 saw logs and started heading back across the lake back to Mackinaw Island. When they were about halfway across, a messenger came to them and said that the ice is porous between Round Island and Mackinaw Island, and they wouldn't be able to haul their loads across. So they diverted and ended at Round Island, unloaded all of the boards, took the horses, put ropes around their neck, and guided them across, and they all made it safely across. But they would eventually retrieve their boards and build their church. And today that's the oldest known church building standing in Michigan. And these original boards, if these were original, to the first construction would have been sawn at Millcreek. So this is the most bizarre map you will see, not only tonight, but in maybe all of your days. It's a wonderful map. I love it. And it was made by Lieutenant Benjamin Poole in 1835 during a survey of a military road or military trail from Saginaw to Mackinaw. What I particularly love about this is that I used to work here at Midland, which is where this is on the Tittabawassee River, and he visited this post, we know that with historical documents, and then started his survey in Saginaw. This is Saginaw Bay, and this arrow is north. So north changes on this map of every line. So this is pointing this way, here it's pointing this way, and then down this way. But it goes this way, and then it continues over here, and over here, and then it ends over here. So let's take a look. Here's the end of it. So this is the end of it, right here. That's where at Dousman's Sawmill. So he ends at Dousman's Mill. And then it says how many miles to Mackinaw Island. And if we're looking at it, we can see a cedar thicket, cedar and spruce swamps, a marsh, a poplar and birch thicket, another marsh, a cranberry marsh, a maple and beech, marshes, marsh, maple, beech, and hemlock, and a cedar swamp, and another cedar swamp. So they mention, I circled the mill. The assistants were frequently employed for days and even weeks in creeping through thickets and windfalls where walking was quite out of the question. Oh my God. It just sounds lovely, doesn't it? And of course, mosquitoes and all that as well. An attempt was made to cut off the bend in the line near the mill. So he's talking about this right here at mile number 2. But it was found that a direct course for the first 4 miles would traverse an almost continuous swamp. So, needless to say, the military road from Mackinaw to Saginaw was never constructed. They thought it was too expensive, it crossed too many streams and swamps, and bridges would have to be made and all sorts of things. But Benjamin Poole ended up dying in St. Augustine, Florida. He was sent down there, and he passed away, and he's buried down there. And our co-worker Jack was just down there visiting that site as well. So let's kind of leap forward just a little bit in time. So about 5 years later, we get another pretty good survey. John Mullet, who Mullet Lake is named after, did lots of surveying throughout northern Michigan. And it quickly goes back after the Dousman era to always being referred to as being associated with the Campbell family. It was Campbell's original private claim, number 334, and it clearly shows it on this map. This survey was redone just a few years later. We'll take a look at that map in a few minutes, and it gives you a lot more detail. Surprisingly, a really good description of the plant life in Sheboygan County was written by James Strang, so the Mormon king on Beaver Island, but he did a whole history of Sheboygan County, and he says the prevailing timber is white pine, white and black oak, sugar maple, beech, elm, Linna's basswood, ash, etc., Norway pine, spruce, fir, hemlock, black ash, ironwood, and numerous other varieties. That's dead on. He says 1854. That's what we have today at Millcreek. The pine is not found in extensive forests, but in small groves or scattered among hard timber in proportion of 8 or 10 trees to the acre. Beech, maple, and oak are found in vast forests on very level plains elevated 20 to 30 feet above the streams. Again, that could be a description of our site. The various evergreens except pine grow in swampy land and along the slope and banks of streams. Thank you, James. That's a very nice description of our forests. And on a map scale, you can see that here. This is Harvey Mellon, did this map in 1856, just a few years later, and he specifically notes on this map in all these different spots aspen, beech, birch, cedar, spruce, willow, hemlock, tamarack, sugar maple, and also features like a marsh or swamp or cedar thicket or willow swamp, an old beaver meadow where there was once a beaver dam that had cleared out and then it grew back up, fields or old fields, an old sugar camp, and a granite boulder out in the woods. So just wonderful depiction of all these things all around our site. It's really specific. There's a willow swamp right here, for example, on the way to Dingman Marsh. Now, if you walk around Millcreek today, you'll probably see old stumps, especially if you pay close attention. And here's some that are out there a little bit off the trail, but they're not necessarily from 1830 or before. They're from more modern era of lumbering. So the forest would grow up, they would cut it down. So second or third growth or whatnot would grow up and cut it down. So the site closed in 1839, and then we'll talk about a little bit about what happened in between. But look, here we're in the 1890s, and Mr. Niflin is getting M. Palmer's logs on the beach and is now getting out ties and posts at Millcreek in 1891. And in 1907, Asa and Clifford Bowen have their logs all skidded and are ready to haul the same to Millcreek. There's no mill there at that time, but still a location that they're cutting lumber at. Charles Sheppy and Frank Johnson are hauling timber to Millcreek in 1913. And some young men are working for Amon Cope at Millcreek, who has a lumber camp in 1923, so 100 years ago. The Cadillac Veneer Company bought some property at Millcreek, 180 acres, and we're going to put in a portable sawmill. So installed portable mill, the Cadillac Veneer Company of Cadillac, Michigan. The concern was purchased 180 acres at Millcreek, formerly owned by the Sheboygan Limestone Company. We'll talk about them in a minute. Is now operating a camp there where they're getting out hardwood logs, pulpwood, cedar, and stovewood. 15 men are employed. In the spring, they plan to install a portable sawmill for the manufacturing of logs. This is their site at Cadillac, and it's showing the veneers going to the kilns. So now we've got the creek, we've got the trees, we've got the water, and there are creatures that live in and around the forests and the water and the streams. And we'll take a short look at a few of these. These are all evidence either in writing or archaeologically. We know that we're at Millcreek. The first one being the passenger pigeon, right? The passenger pigeon. So passenger pigeons were enormously abundant. At one time, it was estimated there were 5 billion passenger pigeons, and they were the most numerous bird species in the world. They nested in huge colonial nestings, and they were hunted at Mackinaw. And for many decades, that was not a problem. There were so many, and they were hunted on such a small scale. Like this visitor that came to Mackinaw, he didn't even worry about how many he had shot. It says, pigeons are often abundant in 1847. John Smith wrote me in a few hours, he shot in the woods 21 pounds of pigeons, picking them off the low trees one by one. On inquiring what he meant by pounds of pigeons, he confessed he was too lazy to count them, so he had his game weighed. So it was about 50 pigeons that was on Mackinaw Island. This is a display at Colonial Mission Mackinaw in our archaeology tunnel, because Lynn and her team have found passenger pigeon bones, and there's some pigeon shot for good measure. They were noted as early as 1773 in writing by fur trader Peter Pond, came through the straits, and they were hunted on Bois Blanc Island in the 1820s, on Mackinaw Island many different times. And commercial sales of passenger pigeons began in this area in 1864 in Sheboygan by Henry Phillips. So that's what eventually would lead to the passenger pigeon demise. And they would go completely extinct in 1914. But for some time, you had enormous quantity of pigeons being hunted by market hunters. So Mr. Phillips reminisces that in 1864, he had this first shipment of live wild pigeons. They brought down the Sheboygan River from Black Lakes in crates, holding 6 dozen each. And this is a lithograph from 1878 that's showing crates of live pigeons for sale. From that time, I handled live pigeons in quantities up to 170,000 a year until they disappeared. Why would someone want to sell crates of live pigeons? Well, you know clay pigeons, right? It was trap shooting contests. So they would put pigeons in a little cage, they would pull open the trap, they would open up, the pigeon would fly out, and they would shoot it. So that's why they were doing that with live pigeons. They were also having barrels and barrels and barrels of dead pigeons that would be stripped down, salted, and sent to restaurants in Chicago and Detroit and out east and whatnot. So here's a picture of one of the boats that hauled some pigeons. We know in 1878, the propeller Lawrence of the Northern Transit Line arrived down yesterday in Detroit. She discharged at this port 6,000 wild pigeons for H.T. Phillips and Company. So what was he doing? Here's his store in Detroit. Henry T. Phillips, game and fruit, zoom-in, you can see this wild game hanging everywhere. So here's turkeys, we have grouse, these are ducks up here, we have grouse. I do not see passenger pigeons in this particular photo, but there are a couple others that weren't of him, where you can see some wild pigeons hanging a very, very long tail. And here's another account from 1878. The city of Toledo, another steamer of the Northern Transit Line, called in, bound down Wednesday afternoon. She took on here in Sheboygan for Detroit between 9,000 and 10,000 live pigeons. So that would eventually, again, do its damage. The largest pigeon nesting ever recorded was in 1878 near Crooked Lake. If you've been to the Odin Fish Hatchery, has everyone been to there? There's a historic marker in their parking lot about the grand nesting of 1878, which is just absolutely enormous, millions and millions of birds, and it kind of passes out of our story here. But they were at Millcreek. We found them archaeologically there, and they were there because of the acorns and beech nuts and the things that were in the forest and the trees that we talked about already. Now the next account we have of Millcreek was written by Samuel C. Clark. He came to visit Mackinaw Island. This is on a little tourist jaunt, and he came in 1868. They wanted to go fishing, so they hired a local guide, and they took him over to Millcreek. He was the brother of Sarah Freeman Clark. Now, Sarah Clark came to Mackinaw in 1844 with the author Margaret Fuller, who were transcendentalists. She wrote a very wonderful account of Mackinaw Island in 1844, so 24 years before her brother arrived. She may have been on that same trip with him as well. We're not entirely sure. But she drew this picture. She was an artist. She drew this picture of Arch Rock and the beach at Robinson's Folly down here as well. And she's a fascinating character as well. Now, Samuel, her brother, says when they hired this little boat, they came over to Millcreek, they're going to go trout fishing. So we landed on a wild and desolate shore, heavily timbered with maple, beech, and pine, and found the natives prepared to resist our invasion. For they attacked us on sight, these tribes of Buzz and Hum. We still have those, by the way. And this is, again, so if the mill closed in 1839, so you're about 30 years later. So things are growing back up again. You've got the thick new growth is growing back up. It's been about 30 years that had time to regrow. Sarah also painted this. It's actually not in Michigan, but it gives a good view for what we're talking about. We made our way up the stream. So picture landing at the beach, which I showed you a minute ago at Millcreek, walking up the stream without the highway there and the railroad and whatnot. And they walked up the stream about half a mile where there had formerly been a sawmill, the ruined dam of which still obstructed the channel. So I could still see the ruins of the dam about 30 years later. It was evident that no trout with the use of his fins would stay here. They were there in like August. It was a horrible time to actually try to go trout fishing there. There had formerly been a cleared spot of land about the mill, but it was fast growing up into forest again. And we know how fast the thick spruce and cedar and all that grows around here. So it was really quickly growing back up. So they didn't find fish. They turned around. They wanted to get the heck out of here. So pursued by the triumphant mosquitoes, we fled to our ships. It was just one. We found the ladies encamped at the water's edge to escape the enemy, who reinforced by all that could sting or bite. Sandflies, punkies, and greenheads, which are just biting flies, seemed to dispose to follow up their victory. So we sailed away from the mosquito shore with swollen and discolored faces resembling a huckleberry pudding. Here's a nice recipe for huckleberry pudding. Now, people, if you went to the right time of year, you could catch trout at Millcreek. And we still have them there today, especially brook trout and some rainbow trout. And in 1902, the Sheboygan Democrat noted that people were catching trout in Millcreek, which is quite a lot of fun. And this is really an ongoing thing you find in newspapers, especially of the late 19th, early 20th century, that it was a common spot, just kind of abandoned along the shore. It was this nice little stream, and people could find some fish there. So George Barber found fish there in 1914. George Barber and Joseph Estlin were at Mill Creek last Sunday where they landed 47 speckled trout. Pretty good haul. Everybody nowadays is going sucker fishing in Mill Creek in May of 1914. And I've seen the white sucker run come up underneath the mill there from the lake to spawn. Game warden Carl Weber, who was game warden throughout northern Michigan here in the 1920s, noted that we have no reported violations of fish laws this past week. It has been too hot to break laws of any kind. But he did bust people at Mill Creek frequently if they weren't following the rules. So this is the very early days of conservation. We have these game wardens actually trying to enforce some of the rules to kind of restore some of these, not only fish, but the waterfowl that we mentioned, the deer and whatnot. And this is him pictured with a sturgeon. Cecil Boardman and Harold Tillman were arrested for spearfishing in Mill Creek by Deputy Conservation Officer Weber on Monday and taken before Justice King, who lent them off by paying a small fine, 1926. And there were smelt runs. So smelt run in Sheboygan, 1968. Who remembers the smelt runs in Mill Creek? My coworker Troy does as well. They don't run there anymore. But they did in the 1960s, and there were newspaper reports all over southern Michigan when the smelt were running, and people would come up and dip for them. And the Conservation Department report that the smelt runs have begun in the Sheboygan area. As the weather warms, dipping is expected to be good in all the streams of the area which empty into Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. Mill Creek, near Mackinaw City, is one of the most popular places. So now we'll take a look at the very rocks that Mill Creek is based on. And this little quote from 1883, the man who can locate a stone quarry near Sheboygan has a bonanza. Got lots of stone around here, right? And we were talking about limestone, of course, which can be used for lots of different things. And the stone at Mill Creek itself was actually very important to the history of the site, and it's not something we really talk about at all, except very briefly in the little video we have at the site. So first, let's take a really big look back, not only of the Great Lakes, but of 375 million years ago, when you're talking about first the Michigan Basin, which was actually not here at all. It was south of the equator, was this big, large, shallow sea. And it would get flooded, and it was salty, so it had these big reefs in it, corals and brachiopods and crinoids and trilobites and all these animals that have these hard shells with lime, and they would die and they would sink into the mud. And a beautiful description of how this process worked was written by Helen Martin. She was one of the first women geologists hired by the state of Michigan, and she wrote in this particular case in 1957 this outline of the geologic history of Sheboygan County. So the sea is flooding, it would dry up, it would flood again, dry up, these layers and layers and layers being added for millions of years. And she mentions that on the sea floor, lime mud deposited. And as the animals died, their shells fell into the muds, which then became the fossil cemeteries of the life of the sea. You can see what sort of rock was made from these muds along Highway 31, just south of Mackinaw City, in the bed of a little stream, Mill Creek, Section 29, Township 39 North, Range 3 West. And these are some of the common fossils. This is I should have brought one. I just found one of these a couple weeks ago. A nice horn coral, and this is the inside of it here, and a little shell here. So this limestone was created by the bodies of these little creatures long before we became a state and whatnot, and even before the Great Lakes were carved out by the glaciers, is really the basis of so much. This 1851 map shows Mill Creek, and it shows a lime kiln on Bois Blanc Island. So the government, when they first moved over to Mackinaw Island, had a kiln there to help get the mortar and the limestone itself for building the walls of Fort Mackinaw and the blockhouses and whatnot. The government had the lime kiln over here on Bois Blanc Island, but they didn't really exploit the lime at Mill Creek. That would be done just a little bit later in private hands. But this is all area, as you know, with all these limestone formations we have, not only up here, but also limestone all along the shore and the fossils we find as well on the lower peninsula. So the earliest account we have of limestone being manufactured or quarried at Mill Creek was about 1864. A man named Mr. Young erected a house and manufactured lime at Mill Creek on the premises of William Wendell, staying for about 2 years. So this was remembered or recalled later by Angelique Bennett. She and her husband Charles lived at Mill Creek for 50 years, longer than anyone else. They were Native American fishermen primarily. They would spend part of their time here at Mill Creek and part of their time over near Cross Village, going back and forth. And one of their children, I'm not going to remember her name, married one of the Marshall family, who was the lighthouse keeper here in Mackinaw City. So William Marshall was the lighthouse keeper at Spectacle Reef. George Marshall was the lighthouse keeper here in Mackinaw City. And another one of the Marshall brothers married their daughter. So their granddaughter, Pearl Hillenberg, lived to a very old age, and she walked around the Mill Creek site with who found Mill Creek? Alice Olson found Mill Creek. She walked all around the site with Alice Olson, and she recalled that the family stories were that this man made charcoal and slacked lime when he lived at Mill Creek, right about the time that the Wendell or the Bennetts were first starting to live there. Here's a picture of a similar time period over in Petoskey. So this is the from the Little Traverse Historical Society, and this is from 1874. So it shows you kind of the tools and the wheelbarrow and stuff, and these men were hacking this out of the bedrock out of the side of the cliff there. In 1883, we have a report from the Sheboygan Democrat that parties had begun to work preparatory to burning lime extensively at Mill Creek. They said they have orders for 40 bushels per day during the season. So you burn lime to get it down to this powdery form, right? You could use that for making mortar, which they did, again, at Mackinaw Island. You can also use it for agricultural lime to spread on your fields, especially if you've got sandy soil or depleted soil from growing too much corn or whatnot, and that's hugely important. Before mechanical techniques were developed to crush lime that small, you had to burn it to get it to that level. But when we finally got a quarry at Mill Creek that was creating agricultural lime, it was using the mechanical means. So we're getting there now. We got the 20th century. First, the Union Carbide Company of Chicago does some explorations at Mill Creek. They're also the ones that help create all the hydroelectric dams at Niagara Falls. They're a huge company. And they did they purchased some options at the of the limestone at Mill Creek, and they tested it out. They thought they might employ 75 men with stone that would last 100 years. That did not pan out. But they did sink some test holes, so somewhere out there, these 2 1/4-inch diamond drill core samples were drilled into the earth at Mill Creek, and they sank a few wells. They decided to go to the UP. So this is the, you probably recognize that if you're from around here, in Sault Ste. Marie, the old power plant that's down near the water there. So they built that. This picture is from 1904, so the year after that. And they decided to kind of focus their work further north. So they did not take the option at Mill Creek. But a few years later, Mr. Willis Durrell decided that he was the one who was going to do that. He was from Cincinnati. He did summers up here at Burt Lake as a cottager, and he heard about this good limestone at this site called Mill Creek, and he decided that he was going to purchase it. He actually leased it for 11 years and see what he could do with the Sheboygan Limestone Products Company. So this long article basically talks about him closing the deal with the Petoskey Mackinaw Real Estate Company. He expects to begin work in the spring. He's going to hire all these local people from around the area, especially Sheboygan and Mackinaw City. And they were going to, the property consists of 700 acres situated on Mill Creek, about 4 miles south of Mackinaw City, known as the Old Dousman Tract. So Lawrence was his son, and he was just out of college. I'm sure he had no interest whatsoever in limestone. But he helped his father for a few years. He ended up becoming quite a well-known botany professor in Colorado, and he wrote several books and whatnot, and that was his tack. Maybe he was inspired by the plants at Mill Creek, but he eventually went into botany. Well, Mr. Durrell did open a limestone company here, so this is 1914 now. And it says, limestone quarries near Freedom are now an assured thing. So the president, he comes up, he's organizing things. The main offices of the company are located in Cincinnati, Mackinaw City, and Sheboygan. So he's from Cincinnati, and he comes up here in the summertime. The quarries, land, buildings, kilns, and the like will estimated to be $100,000 valuation. Sheboygan labor will be employed to a large extent, and the men encouraged to build homes and farm on a small scale in the vicinity of the quarry. So Freedom, what once existed, well, you know that. You've got the schoolhouse out there at your site, right down the road from Millcreek, very close to Millcreek. The opening of these limestone quarries will be a big factor in developing that section of the county. Besides limestone products, stone will be shipped out here in large quantities. Sheboygan merchants will come in from their share of benefits and supplies and blah, 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 blah. So he did build a spur off the railroad into Mill Creek. And in one particular order, they ordered, how many is it? I think it was 11 railroad cars full of limestone for road construction in Sheboygan. So that was part of their business. Most of their business was agricultural lime. The first photographs we have of the site are from the explorations of that quarry being established. So this picture was taken about 1915. You can see a little boat along the shore. So this is Lake Huron, right out here. This is basically the same pathway that we have with this new bridge that we put along the stream here, right by the mill. Of course, the highway was not constructed yet. The railroad you can see there in a second. This is the photographer's horse. Actually, his horse is right there. And there's the buggy. He's standing up on the bluff, kind of looking down. There's the creek, kind of runs through the low part here. And that's why there's cedar trees or spruce trees here. This is the former mill site. So we've reconstructed the mill right here. Look how open it still is. You can see a fence in the background and whatnot. The Michigan Central, MC, this is the railroad track that runs through there. So that's the rail trail today. So that's the site. That's one of the first pictures we have of it. And then they had a couple pictures just of stone. So clay, stone mixed, just kind of somewhere along the bluff there. Kind of hard to tell for sure. And there's another one that just goes in more of a curved part of a hill, but these were again in Petoskey at the Little Traverse Historical Society. What I found, though, is all these advertisements for agricultural limestone in downstate newspapers. So, agricultural limestone, prepare for your farm. Get the best. Our quarry tests 98.71% pure calcium carbonate, the Sheboygan County limestone product, Mackinaw City, Michigan. Agricultural limestone, purest and best on the market, Sheboygan County Limestone Company, Mackinaw City. We will be prepared to fill your order after July 1st. Our stone is the highest grade calcium carbonate and finished with a Jeffrey swing hammer pulverizer. I'm like, what the heck is that? So I looked it up, and it's this machine. This is a portable version of it. It was developed down, I think in Ohio actually, for coal mining. And they adapted the technology for limestone production. So you basically got it down to chunk form, and you fed it into this machine, it would come out as powder. So this is a whole big pile of lime that they shipped down in barrels downstate and poured all over the fields of Midland and Saginaw and Bay City and all over the Thumb and whatnot, where my family was from back in the day. So why use low grade when pure stuff costs no more? So it was just great. So this is 1914, 1915, 1916. It would actually go until the 1920s. They also used the product for all these other industries that you don't normally think of. So it was used for fluxing purposes, for steel making, manufacturing of Portland cement, which we kind of knew that for little mortar and whatnot, for making sugar, carbide, and for use in the soda ash and chemical industries. So Dow Chemical Company was using this stuff. There was a glass manufacturing plant in Saginaw. There's all sorts of different uses for this stuff, especially the pure stuff that they were getting here. And it also is usable for road making, concrete, and ballast. So all sorts of things. And this is a sugar factory down in St. Louis, Michigan, not far from Midland and Alma. And they ran through the 1922 season. Their lease was up. Mr. Durrell went back to Cincinnati. He created what is it called? The something less gas company. And it was for fuel-saving product for automobiles, is what he went to after that. And his son went on to be a botanist. So after they leave, kind of a big business left. You know, it was a pretty good business for over a decade. And you start getting this situation. So this is 1935, the Michigan State Tax Commission map, and all these are reverted for back taxes back to the state of Michigan. So and that's what happened to the site at Millcreek as well. As unpaid taxes, the land goes back into the public trust. The Michigan, what was it called? The Mackinaw Hardwood Forest, or Hardwood State Forest is what it was called. It was the state forest in this area that was created after all these parcels and more just fell back into public ownership. They tried to sell the land at Millcreek in 1930, from multiple advertisements for this. I didn't see that anyone ever actually bought the main site. You can see here it says it's 508 acres, so they actually did a couple of pieces, kind of were sloughed off of it. Today we own about 620 acres, so about 20 acres less than the original claim. These two pieces on the west were what were eventually first removed. And they even mention in this article in 1930, so over about 100 years after the mill had been abandoned, the Millcreek flows nearly the entire length of this claim, furnished the motive power for one of the first mills erected in Michigan. So they were remembering that about 100 years after the mill had closed. I thought this was a little fun one. So this is, you know, this site, right? This is the old railroad roundhouse. And in the Emmet County Graphic, I was just scrolling through, in July 8th, 1937, they mentioned that a beaver fell into the turntable pit, which would have been right down here, in the railroad yards last week. It was caught and taken to Millcreek, where it was released. The beaver weighed approximately 35 pounds. And that's the only time anyone was ever kind to a poor beaver. With the whole fur trade history we have, and hunting, and mountains and packages of piles of furs, they released this poor beaver who had fallen into the pit out at Millcreek. So his descendants are probably still there, because we still have the around Millcreek. Then you really dig and you start seeing all these different things, especially as different reports and books and whatnot have been digitized, easier to access, rather than going to an archive and scrolling through books looking for any mention of Millcreek. So here's 1938. The Millcreek Quarry is a stop on the Michigan Academy of Science, Arts, and Letters field excursion. They do geology excursions in northern Michigan, and the old Millcreek Quarry is one of the spots that they're stopping and looking at the walls of the site that had been carved away. So basically where our saw pit is today, the little picnic area, and the grassy knoll, if you will, kind of near the bridge, that had been filled in before the park was created, and that was part of the old quarry pits. In 1944, this one's kind of odd. Roman Kent of the University of Michigan, so we're close to the Pellston Biological Station, right, for U of M. He used Millcreek as a study in the freshwater triclads of Michigan. And they had a picture. So this is the highway, went through in 1927. I'm like, what is a triclad? It's this little planaria, these little teeny tiny little critters, even little eyes. And they were in the mouth, basically the river mouth, between Millcreek and the lake. So there's an unusual study for you. Here's a geological report from 1945. And this is the Bois Blanc limestone formation. Again, it's about 385 million years old or so. And this is a picture, and you can really see this. Oh yeah, this is kind of like our overlook is up here, right? And we're standing down near below at that little grassy knoll that I mentioned. And you can zoom in, and he's kind of investigating the rocks here, and the layers of the limestone and the fossils and whatnot. In 1957, Garland Lemoire of Sheboygan saw an albino doe in the woods near Millcreek, Sheboygan County. The Free Press picked that one up. That's not the actual animal. 1964, publication National Museum of Canada publishes an article denoting 22 species of mosses growing in Millcreek. No one pays attention to mosses or triclads, but they did it in Millcreek in 1964. And then Ellis Olson, I can't believe his name skipped my mind for a moment, began searching for the old millstones at Millcreek, finding some of these old articles, which I've referenced over time, about the grist mill and the stones being moved to Sheboygan and whatnot. He actually abandoned his search at one point, but then he kind of went back and he found, especially the first stone in Myers Creek, and then the second stone was actually found near Sheboygan itself. We opened up as the 94th State Park in 1984. That was the first year I was a Boy Scout on Mackinaw Island, the Scout Service Camp, so I remember visiting. My little brother, who was 4 years younger than me, he would have been 8, was on the bottom of the pit saw that year, so he has fond memories of that as well. There were 550 acres at that point, so we've gathered a little bit of land since then. So it was originally called Old Millcreek, so when you go there, you see the original historical marker that was put up. Kind of renamed ourselves and reinvented ourselves several times. But I like to think when you look at this long history of Millcreek and all the different things that have happened there over time, we're still kind of doing that in our own way. 1993, so this is when I was an interpreter on Mackinaw Island at Fort Mackinaw. There's just various articles about the things that are being offered in Millcreek, noting several times that it's the least well-known park. It's just harder to get people there, a few miles outside of town. But nevertheless, there's certainly a lot to offer. There's Jeff Dykehouse, a naturalist, who was there for 36 years, almost his entire career. 2008, we opened up the adventure tour, again, trying to get more people to visit the site. These things were very uncommon in northern Michigan at the time, zip lines, climbing walls, whatnot. It really spiked the attendance for a while, but then it did kind of taper off and actually went down. You know, it's hard to get people out there sometimes. And the staffing just became pretty prohibitive to keep running such an intensive program, so we decided to transition away from that as well. So last year, the zip line was taken out, the climbing wall was taken off the tower. This tower is still there, of course. We moved the saw pit from the location over by the workshop to this side of the creek, and we're making plans to renovate. And you'll see in a second another note about that. We're going to renovate the visitor center, new exhibits, and all that. The plan is to start this fall to be open next year. The most new and noteworthy thing, though, is this. So if you don't follow our blog or our Facebook page, you can look at this thing and say, what the heck is that? So Troy Allaire found this. He was our park ranger for many years out there. When he was wading in the lake, putting in the pipe or taking it out in the summer. I think he was putting it in because we pump water from Lake Huron into our mill pond so we can continue to run the mill all summer. So this weird thing, he picked it up. He's like, Kyle, what is that? I'm like, I don't know. And it kind of looks like clay, maybe an old piece of wood. Really wasn't sure. It took me 5 different experts, lots of emails to figure out what it was. And here's a historic image of almost the exact same thing. This is from Germany, and the director of the Paleontology Museum at the University of Michigan said, well, I know what that is. It's a fish spine. So this is the fin of a fish. These 2 front fins have this big spine on this certain species of fish, and here's a full one. And these are the first fish in the world to have jaws and to have scales. And we're talking 385 million years ago, very early primitive kind of fish, and it's the spine from their fin. And here's a graphic representation of what it might have looked like. And here's the spine on the front. Actually, most of this was cartilage and softer materials and that really are known from their spines. But this is the first vertebrate fossil, to my knowledge, ever discovered in the Straits of Mackinac. So Troy just picked it up. He was sitting there in his bathing suit. And the paleontologist, the director of the museum at the University of Michigan said, congratulations to your coworker, because from his record, none of these fossils have ever been found in the Bois Blanc limestone formation anywhere in Michigan. So there was one small fragment found along the shore of Lake Erie in Ontario. So really quite remarkable.
When did he find it?
Last August.
Yeah.
So another thing that we're doing, so if you're interested, I wrote a whole blog post on it. Head up to our Facebook page or our website and you can see more about it. We are repairing the sawmill, and the repairs are almost complete. Thankfully, the ice storm did not slow us down too much. We finally did get power back last Friday. What we repaired specifically is this wooden box that holds 1,800 gallons of water underneath the mill. Constantly wet, constantly moving. This pitman arm actually broke partway through, or very end of the season last year. And this leaked like crazy, so it really needed to be replaced. So it was removed at the end of last season, which was quite shocking to see. So the entire thing is gone, and we started repairing the water wheel a little bit here as well, and it was replaced with a concrete structure. So all of this now is encased in wood. And I went out there today to take a picture of it, and there was an excavator perched right in front of our driveway of the site, hauling up the highway construction. So I could not drive in there today, but it all looks beautiful. It's all covered in wood now. They've got new gates that are up inside. The guts of it inside that no one can see are more modern. There's a clean out at the bottom, so when sticks get sucked in, Troy can actually open it up and get them out. So very much approved. So it's all going to be the appearance of a historic structure, but much more manageable, and it will work much better. They also put a lining, this is just covering it up, a lining inside this wooden trough, which again, leaked like crazy because it's just a wooden trough. And that's, again, a modern feature that's kind of hidden from view, but will make our mill last many, many more years. I mean, it's opened in 1984, so it's getting a little up there. The visitor center upgrades, which are going to be, so next winter, I'm going to be doing a lot of writing of new exhibits. So these are some of the oldest exhibits we have in the park system. When the building opened in 1984, a few upgrades have been put in, but not many. So you can still find the words Old Mill Creek and some of the signage in there. I stuck some of the larger taxidermy mounts. They were all up in the rafters, getting horribly sun bleached with UV light over many decades. And I put a few of the larger ones in the cases so people can still see them, and others have been pulled off to, well, some were beyond repair, and others are being used for educational programs. This little guy still peeks out at you from up above, though. And part of that is not just the exhibits. We're going to have a whole new roof. We're going to take out the skylights. We're going to redo the restrooms. There used to be a cafe at that building, or the outbuilding where the restrooms are. All new restrooms. It's just going to be much refreshed, and it's going to be a really great boost. Again, something new at the site for the first time in quite a while. So it's going to be really nice. I'm really looking forward to it. This summer, we're going to have these theme weeks again. We tried this last year, and it's just nice to kind of focus on a certain topic, especially with the nature programs, but also some with the history. We'll have a wildlife week in June. This is just a joke. There's a giant beaver attacking people. We talk about the frogs. In fact, one of my employees this year, Sarah Burgoyne, she's getting her degree from Central Michigan University. She's huge on herpetology. So she did a survey of herpetology on Mackinaw Island last summer. She was park operations over there. So she'll definitely be celebrating the frogs and salamanders and snakes and whatnot. I did not put a snake picture here because I know some of you might not like snakes. This is a raccoon family that I took a picture of up in a tree at Millcreek. And there's a black-burning warbler. We also did a week of hay cutters and summer pasture. So kind of going to the agricultural side. So 10 fragments of scythe blades have been found out at Mill Creek archaeologically in the past. So hay cutting was so important out there. And we kind of focus on that and also talk about some of the plants they were cutting. Not only the planted clover and timothy and whatnot, but some of the sedges and wild hay that were being cut in the area as well, just to kind of shed light on that little known part of the story. And then we also have a week called Lost Rocks and Mackinaw Millstones. You walk through the woods, you find all these lost rocks or these granite boulders that came down with the glaciers, these glacial erratics. And again, that's what we believe, and you can see it looks quite hand-hewn from a granite boulder, are our millstones here. And even though they're not operable today, we can highlight that part of the story, show some of the tools that were used, and again, archaeologically, quite a few items that had been discovered. And it's kind of an interesting story that you don't get to see much of on a normal basis. So, you all stuck with me, you all stayed awake, and I really appreciate your time and attention today. Hopefully you shed a little bit of a different light on a Mill Creek, kind of a well-known site that we all think we know of, and then you start looking a little deeper and you find all these interesting and different sides to the story. So, thank you very much, and I'll take any questions if anybody has any, or any has any. Hello, Fremont.
Go first.
Yeah, right here.
Oh, you were mentioning that there were 5 billion passenger pigeons?
Yeah.
Billion, with a B, right?
The most populous bird in the world, they believe. Yes.
And it went
Entirely
extinct?
gone. So, they were all over the eastern half of the United States. It was a native species. They have many remarkable features. They were about twice the size of a mourning dove, about 16 inches long from head to the tip of their very long tail. They could fly 50 to 60 miles an hour, very fast, they were very agile. And when they would go over in huge flocks, there were many accounts that said it sounded like a thunderstorm or a tornado was approaching, and it would darken the sun, and sometimes for days at a time. It was like a feature of nature that we can't really picture anymore. If you look of murmuration of starlings, so European starlings will fly in this huge flock and they'll like wave, you know, and the pigeons did that sort of thing, especially if like a hawk or something would dive into their you know, just this whole wave of biology in the air. And they would land and they would do these communal nests. So these huge areas. So the nesting in near Petoskey, north of Petoskey in 1878 was 40 miles long from end to end. And I believe it was the largest nesting ever recorded by people. Who knows if it was ever the largest one. But there are many, many accounts where people would say it was dangerous to walk in a pigeon nesting because large limbs would come crashing out of the trees. You can picture the ice storm because of the weight of the birds. And these are only birds that weigh at most 16 ounces. You know, so you got huge quantities of birds. And then the scat or the droppings would just coat the forest floor in this huge thick mass. So just biological storm. So what really happened is small scale hunting from Native Americans, settlers, whatnot, as birds would come and nest and whatnot, negligible, right? Yeah. But you had two things. You had railroads, telegraph, and the railroads and the telegraph were the two big things, and lumbering. So the railroads, telegraphs, and lumbering. So let's say a nesting does happen north of Petoskey, and the people up here say, hey, the birds are starting to nest, and they send it out across the telegraph wires. Market hunters from all over the eastern United States would hop on trains, come all the way up to northern Michigan in a day or less, and set up camp. And they would harvest huge numbers of pigeons. They had big, long nets. They were about 20 feet long. They had two side by side. Then they would be about 20 feet long and about 3 feet wide, let's say. And they would salt the insides, and they would have stool pigeons. You heard the word stool pigeon, right? A stool pigeon is a trained passenger pigeon that would sit on a little perch with a long cord attached to him, and they would hide, and they would pull the stool pigeon, and he would flutter up and then back down again. And he'd flutter up and back down again to draw in the wild pigeons. And they say, oh, there's a pigeon down there. And then they land, and they're like, oh, there's this, you know, salted ground. And then they pull these cords, and these nets would flap over, and they capture over 1,000 at a pull. And they could do that multiple times a day. And they shot them, they cut trees down to get nestlings, they lit sulfur fires under the nest so they would drop out of the trees. And at the same time, whole-scale lumbering across the entire state was cutting all these forests they depended on for food. So when you had that kind of hunting pressure, that much altering the environment, their population crashed. So by the last passenger pigeons ever seen on Mackinaw Island were 1888 or 84, one of those in the 80s. And there was a small flock, about 50 or so, that were on Mackinaw Island. But none since then. But yeah, remarkable.
That's amazing.
Yeah. All right, someone else, Angie had a question.
You said that in '94 you guys became a park, right?
84.
84. Now, was that underneath the auspice of?
So we were part of Hardwood State Forest with the DNR.
Okay.
So Ellis Olson said, hey, you should do some archaeology out there. The park did some archaeology on state land. Said, oh, we found all this cool stuff. We proposed that we create a state park within the umbrella of Mackinaw State Historic Parks. And we proposed this to the Department of Natural Resources. They said, okay, we are authorized to do that. They basically transferred the deed, if you will, to the branch of our Mackinaw State Historic Parks, with the stipulation is that we have to maintain it as a park open for the public. If we ever decide we do not do that again, it converts back to the state forest system. We also, you can fish the park, you can hunt the park, people trap there, they hunt deer. You know, I was out there, you know, hiking around the woods, and people walk by with shotguns and all their orange stuff on and everything. It's state land, it's available, and we're not open to the public at that point anyway.
So you don't charge for the park anymore, or?
We do not charge for walking the trails. We close in, well, this year it's going to be in Labor Day weekend is when we close our facilities. So we charge from May, June, July, August, basically, when our staff is there, our stores are open, our bathrooms are open, our historical demonstrations are open, and all that stuff. And then, like, if you were to go there after hours, when our gate is closed, you can still park out on our main lot out by the road and still walk the trails for free. But when we're open with our stuff going on, we charge admission to cover our costs. But then the rest of the entire year, you can just park out in that front lot near the flagpoles, and you can not only walk the trails, you can walk all 640 acres and beyond. You know, you can just have at it, yeah, and enjoy. Yeah.
Excellent.
How much is the admission?
Ah, that's a good question.
You want me to look it up?
Yeah, she's gonna look it up for you. Yeah. We always, you know,
Less than 14, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll look it up.
we tinker with it a little bit, and then we're busy doing the program, so we're not manning the register, so I always kind of have to look it up. But yeah, it's, and then we also have the Mackinaw Associates group, which is our friends group, which helps fund lots of different initiatives, exhibits. The Millcreek Nature Center on Mackinaw Island, the exhibits over there were funded by donation, and the friends have different levels, and you get free tickets and unlimited admissions to the sites and all that stuff if you choose
It's
to do that.
included in the pass that goes with them, yeah.
Yep, yeah, there's different levels, so some of them offer guest passes and whatnot, but like my wife and I join, you know, as a friend level or whatever, and she can always come to the parks anytime, and
And are you still hiring people as well?
the parks are hiring people. My staff, my interpretive staff for the summer is filled, so I'll have 2 naturalists and 2 historical interpreters out at Millcreek. And then, again, the naturalist at the Millcreek Nature Center on Mackinaw Island. And my intern on the island this year is actually doing a forest survey. It was first done in the late 1930s by a professor from Indiana or Ohio. I think it was Indiana. In the 1930s, it was redone in the 1970s, and she's going to do it again in 2025. So we're going to get quite a long look at the hardwood forest near Fort Holmes. Over the scientifically laying out plots and whatnot, counting trees and the sizes and all that stuff. All of us over a 100-year span. So it'll be really interesting, really cool to see. And she's coming from Florida to do that. You found it?
Adults $11, kids $8.50.
That's for all the parks?
That's for Millcreek.
Just Millcreek.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's for Millcreek.
Yeah, there's different
Yeah.
packages and whatnot. Any questions online? No, doesn't look like it. All right, thank you all very much. If you get some snacks, if you want to ask more questions, feel free to do so. We don't have to sit here. I'll hang around for a few minutes. And thank you very much again for coming. Really appreciate it.
Really good interpretation and
No,
past vision story.
Which I made passenger pigeon pie and my recipe is talks about that.
coming. Yeah, really appreciate it. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Huh? They made pie out of it? Yeah.
Did you see St. Helena?
Talk with you, right? Yep, me too. Yeah, already.
Yeah, there's
The
so many
timbers
different
in the
stories.
basement
People spend so
sailing,
much
they
time
were
there that we
milled
don't
at
remember.
Oh, really?